All right, thank you for including me on this panel. I'm going to first give a caveat. I'm going to keep my discussion fairly big picture, and so I'm going to discuss the pedagogy behind why we decided to develop some podcasts for a climate change class that we taught in the fall. I am not, using the technology to produce the podcast falls outside my skill set. My most recent experience with Audacity was recording an interview with my grandfather for NPR's Storytime or StoryCorps, and then promptly deleting that interview without saving it. And my grandpa doesn't know that, and he's not on Adobe Connect, and we're going to redo that interview at the next holiday. But that's the reason why I did not actually, wasn't very helpful with the students in actually producing the podcast, but I'll talk a bit why we decided to do the podcast to produce course content for this course, and what we learned and what things we might want to change next time we do it. I'm going to give you a bit of a backstory about why I think podcasts can be a useful way, not in terms of delivering course content to students, but actually what students can produce to help translate what they're learning in the classroom for a different audience. And then when we get to the case of the climate change class, I'll talk a bit about who that audience actually was. When I started my graduate program in sociology in 2003 and 2004, that was at the time when you saw a movement in American sociology around what Michael Burvoy called public sociology. In his presidential address to the American Sociological Association, he described how for decades sociologists have taken knowledge about the social world from their observations and their experiences, created kind of professionalized sociological knowledge, but then failed to make that knowledge relevant for the communities that we actually study. And so he called for sociologists to participate in what he called this systematic back translation. How can we take what we know about the social world and produce content for policymakers or for communities that might be able to use that knowledge to better their own environments? Since then, we've seen sort of the growth of various kinds of platforms for social scientists to do some of this back translating and to produce content for audiences sort of outside of academia. One example that I'm a part of is the Scholar Strategy Network. This is an organization created by Theda Skocpol at Harvard that brings together social scientists doing policy-relevant work on things like the environment or voting or prison reform and producing two-page policy papers. And these policy papers are then available to the media. They're available to policymakers. Some of us get called in to do interviews. Some get called in to do expert testimonies in trials. But it's an outlet to produce this kind of content for a different audience than who might be reading our academic articles, especially if those articles are behind paywalls and that sort of thing. Another organization that I'm more intimately connected with is the Society Pages. The Society Pages, that is Chris Eugen and Doug Hartman from the Sociology Department of Minnesota. They're also known as the Starsky and Hutch of sociology because of this photo. The Society Pages gets a few 100,000 unique page hits every month. It emerged when Chris and Doug were the editors of Context, which is the magazine of the American Sociological Association, intently designed to produce sociology for the masses. When Context moved to a different university, they created the Society Pages, and there's original research content, there's interviews, there's podcasts, and other types of content to help serve this sort of public sociology mission. The reason why I present both of these is because both the Society Pages and the Scholar Strategy Network have been active in producing podcasts as one way to deliver content and for academics to participate in this process of back translation. So you can see examples at the Scholar Strategy Network. There's one, most recent one was with Josh Inwood from the University of Tennessee on Truth and Reconciliation. Recent one with Dana Fisher from Maryland on climate change politics. These podcasts tend to be anywhere from 15 minutes to an hour long, and they tend to be sort of a long form interview with kind of a light touch on editing, but an interview between somebody from SSN, perhaps an editor or another academic, and interviewing a scholar about their research. See the same thing at the Society Pages, kind of cutely known as Office Hours. Great podcast with Lane Kenworthy on inequality, one of the more foremost researchers in American sociology on the issue of inequality. We also had interviews, not with academics, but sort of with public intellectuals. And so we had interviews with Chuck Klosterman on popular culture, and so we had our pop culture editor, Dave Grazian from the University of Pennsylvania, conduct a couple of hours of interviews with Chuck Klosterman, and we would edit the front end and the back end and maybe take out a few ums and ers when we could, but then would just put the entire interview online. So you can think of these podcasts, if you're a podcast listener, if you read or listened to Mark Maron, the comedian's podcast interview with Barack Obama, it's an hour and a half long, very little editing, and it's just a one-on-one dialogue. And that's what a lot of these podcasts are like. So I'll give you a little bit of overview of what this course was about. So this was a course that was part of the Commission on the Liberal Arts. It was called Paris as an Explanation, Understanding Climate Change at the 2015 United Nations meeting in France. It had a unique credit structure in the sense that 15 students enrolled in the class in the fall semester for 1 credit. It's an interdisciplinary class about climate change with a lot of experiential learning. So we had Ari Saikawa in environmental science gave lectures on sort of the fundamentals of climate change science. I organized mock sort of United Nations negotiations so that students could represent countries and try and reach a new climate deal. We brought in coffee farmers from Nicaragua to talk about climate change adaptation. And then we also, throughout this entire course, we produced a lot of content. And that content was really guided by Sheila Tefton Journalism to produce blog posts and web pages, create profile, sort of social media profiles for the students who are in this class, as well as these podcasts. So you had 15 students take the class in the fall for 1 credit, and then 9 students ended up going to Paris for the UN climate change meetings for an additional credit. And so trying to manage expectations for students who were in the course with kind of different expectations for what the course would be about. 9 got to go to Paris, and the other 6 did not, created its own unique challenges. So as I mentioned, part of the goal was to create a lot of content. And it's partly because students were going to Paris. We wanted to ensure that because this was a unique opportunity for Emory, that those students brought that experience back to the Emory community. And so we had a lot of content being produced while we were in Paris. Students were getting invitations to give interviews for WABE in Atlanta. They gave interviews for Boston Public Radio. There was a lot of outlets for students to talk about their experience, and that created this sort of unique audience for the type of content that students were learning, and then also doing the back translating process and then the communication. How do we share what we're learning in class and in Paris with this broader community? So one of the course objectives was to present this climate change related materials critically and effectively through various types of media. Not in my own classes, I don't do a lot of media production, and there can be this tension between making sure you have the right balance between course content and then media. Sometimes media can become the end in itself, and sometimes we don't ever actually match the kind of media that fits well with the content that students are learning. I think this was a good experience for us. We had 3 faculty from 3 different departments. We all have different teaching styles. To think about what are the students learning, how can they translate that and communicate that, and then how do we find the right media for them to deliver that information to this audience who's not in the class. And so the project that we came up with were these podcasts. So some of the challenges for developing this material, so translation, as I mentioned, what should be the content? We had students learning climate change science. They were learning things about business and climate change adaptation and rural agriculture, a lot of different material. So what was the content that they were learning, and then how did they want to translate that? And then communication, what should be the proper medium? Should it be blog posts? Should it be internal dialogue among students on a private web page? Should it be something more involved like these podcasts? And then finally, feasibility, and that's really what is appropriate for a 1 credit class. What I realized when teaching the class is that producing a podcast is a lot of work. And had we done the original podcast I wanted to do, it would have been even more work. And trying to balance students' commitments, and there's also the challenge of student expectations for what should be required in a 1 credit class. And I think we designed content that was appropriate, but I'm not sure that all the students always agreed. All right, so the podcast assignment. So I mentioned, and this is why I think that background was important, the kind of podcasts that I listen to and the kind of podcasts I participate in tend to be these long-form kinds of interviews, or they are highly produced, serialized kind of podcasts like Serial or This American Life. A long-form interview of 30 minutes or more with an activist or somebody from industry or a scholar on their climate change research or their climate change activism would require a lot of research on behalf of students. They would have to develop a long battery of questions to engage that interview, and then they would conduct the interview. And for a 30-minute interview for students in a 1 credit class turned out to be quite a bit. I think it was probably too much for us to ask. I also underestimate how much editing is still required for a long-form kind of interview. And it was also clear that it wasn't quite the right audience. a big audience for this material were other students at Emory. I don't think the other students at Emory are necessarily interested in a 30-minute interview that their friend did with one of us climate scientists. And so I don't think it would have communicated the right message. And so we had to create a different kind of podcast assignment. And luckily, Sheila had been doing this a lot in her other classes and had great ideas on how to narrow this down a bit. So the podcast we ended up with was 2 3-minute podcasts. So they're more like sort of short media segments that you might hear on the radio. 2 3-minute podcasts on a climate change topic, and students had to identify 2 experts and a student that would provide the content for the podcast. And so students worked in pairs. They selected a topic that they wanted to know more about, and so some students created podcasts on things like the VW emission scandal, or climate change in agriculture, or climate change in social movements and protests of oil companies, a lot of different kinds of topics. The steps were that in the first couple weeks of class, Sheila organized an all-day media workshop on a first Saturday in the semester where students learned how to use technology, how to rent microphones from the library, and then really how to use Audacity to manage and manipulate their sound data to produce content. They would choose topic, conduct the research, they would identify the experts. This is another challenge that we had, is that it's partly a benefit. We have tremendous people at Emory that do work on climate change. Because of that, all of our students want to interview the same people. So really this podcast are excellent archives of Peggy Bartlett and John Wagner, but we had to sort of push students to broaden their scope a bit and not keep interviewing the same people, or else we wouldn't quite get the breadth that we wanted. Content would have been fantastic, but we wanted a broad scope. Identify the experts, and then develop sort of an interview protocol. What kinds of questions were you going to ask? Some interviews were quite long. I was interviewed on one of the VW podcasts. My interview was quite short because I didn't have a lot to say, because I thought it was pretty straightforward what happened. But anyway, conduct the interviews with the recording equipment from the library, and then write a script. They would write a script, they'd then send those scripts to the faculty. We would provide feedback on those scripts, and then really edit and produce the final podcast. And to do that, they really had to work closely with Sheila, because editing and producing a podcast is a tremendous amount of work. And so they would have interviews that would be 15, 30 minutes long. They would interview a student, oftentimes it was their roommate, and then they would have to narrow that down to 3 sensible minutes and 3 short kind of sound clips. They then created a website, and this is the latest version of the website. They've created a new organization called the Emory Climate Organization, and these podcasts are on the website. What I thought I would do is just play the beginning of one podcast just so you can get a sense of what it sounded like, and then the professionalism that students ended up, I think, exhibiting. So you can see all the podcasts are embedded in the website. I'll choose one that has a nice intro.
When do we want it? Now! No justice, no peace, no clean air, no peace.
A person who started with Dr. King in 1959, 1960, in and out of jail all of those times, and began to understand what civil rights really meant. It meant that everybody has a right to vote. Everybody had a right to housing and transportation, equal rights. And one of the things that I began to find 7 years ago, climate change. Now, to me, that was a foreign topic because other issues were more important to me.
Reverend Gerald Durley is pastor emeritus at the Providence Missionary Baptist Church in Atlanta and a prominent civil rights activist. Since marching on Washington in 1963, Dr. Durley has passionately combined faith and science with the lessons learned in his historic civil rights fight to campaign for environmental and climate change issues. To him, global warming is a social issue.
But I began to understand and go into in-depth about global warming, environmental justice, climate change, and began to look at that this was an issue that was negatively, disproportionately impacting African American communities and poor communities all over the world.
You'll have to go online to listen to the rest, but it's fantastic. I met with students throughout the semester. They had mixed feelings about producing the content for the podcast. I think they underestimated how much time it would take to do the actual editing. But I think a biggest testament to what students got out of this, over spring break, I took students to Nicaragua to visit some of those coffee farms. 3 of the students with me were in that climate change class. And we were in the bus with 17 other students that weren't in that class, and they all wanted to listen to these podcasts. And so I was playing all the podcasts through the bus, and I asked the students, like, so what did you really think about producing the podcast? And they, the 3 that were on the trip said, it was a lot of work, and we hated it while we were doing it, but we're really proud of it, and it's really cool content. So I think it is a useful way for students to do that back translating, take what they're learning in the classroom, figure out a way to explain that it's very complicated kinds of climate change issues, and then communicate that through a medium like a podcast. Was I think a really useful project for them. So, right. Thank you.